Hello and welcome to Hot and Heavy, the Elaine podcast. I'm your host, Shivani Desai. Today I'll be talking about Season 3, Episode 5, The Library. Hello everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm doing great. It's been a couple weeks. I took a week off from the pod because I went on a little mini break, if I want to be British, a mini break to Palm Springs with my best friend, and we had a great time. It was for my birthday, so this is my first recording of my podcast as a 43-year-old woman. I feel really different. No, I don't. I feel the same. But yes, I am a 43-year-old woman now, and I had a wonderful time. I'd never been to Palm Springs before. Yeah, it was kind of fun just to watch the bouginess and the people and the bougie people. It was just fun. A lot of bouginess, and I was there for it. Felt a little bit like an imposter, but I didn't mind it. I had a wonderful time. My best friend and I, we can just talk and talk and talk, and that's really all we did. All we wanted was just some time together. It was pretty much perfect. This is a very special episode of Hot and Heavy because I had the opportunity to interview the director for this episode. Yes. Can you believe it? I still can't believe it. One of our contributors, Lee, who has sent in some wonderful comments in previous episodes, he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I know Josh White, the director of the library episode." And this was back when I hadn't even started recording Hot and Heavy, but I had recruited all my contributors. And so Lee got in touch with me and I was just like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. And he said, would you be interested in perhaps getting in touch with him to discuss the library episode when you get to it? Well, that was pretty much a no-brainer. Of course, I said yes. So as we were approaching this episode, Lee got in touch with me and said, hey, it's offer's still on the table. Would you like to meet Josh? So long story short, I got to talk to Josh a couple of weeks ago and record an interview with him. And he was just a delight. So I'm really excited for you to hear later in this episode, the interview with Josh. It was just there's no other word, just a delight. Please stay tuned for that later in the episode. But let's get into it. The synopsis for this episode from my coffee table book is as follows. The public library contacts Jerry about a book he took out but never returned back in 1971. George remembers borrowing the book from Jerry, but he lost it when their school gym teacher gave him a wedgie in the locker room. Kramer woos a bookish librarian, while Elaine fears for her job after her boss is cryptic about a manuscript she recommended. This episode is written by Larry Charles. So the first couple scenes, there's no Elaine, but I will cover them really quick. The first scene is in Jerry's apartment. He's on the phone with the library, just going, this is ridiculous. It's from 1971, and I know he's convinced he did return the Tropic of Cancer. Kramer comes in and asks what's going on. Jerry tells him how ridiculous it is, that they're trying to track down this book. Kramer thinks he'll probably owe up to $50,000. I mean, every day, that late fee? But Jerry insists, no, I returned the book. I remember the day. Sherry Becker. She was developing a body in secret under loose clothing, and then one day she wore an orange dress that revealed this apparently amazing body that was just burned in Jerry's memory, to which Kramer says, ooh, memory burn. George buzzes, so Jerry has to get going, and even though Kramer says how much he hates the library, he's very interested in going. So we move on to the library scene, and Kramer can't stop criticizing the library. Now he's on to the Dewey Decimal System. What a scam that was. Shushed by a paper reader over and over. There's a guy reading the paper on one of those long rods, another thing that Kramer doesn't like, keeps shushing them. And the librarian is completely ignoring Jerry. This woman is completely ignoring me. And Kramer's very fascinated by her, the whole librarian. She's a lonely woman probably, looking for companionship, maybe a virgin. Kramer is very intrigued. The librarian is played by Ashley Gardner. There's not a ton on her IMDb page, and she's certainly more, from what I gathered on her page, the little that's on there, that she's more of a stage actress. And this episode of Seinfeld was, in fact, her television debut, so very first television role. I really loved her performance. I think she's really strong, and to have to play against Michael Richards, that's not easy. I mean, he's such a big presence on camera. And of course, Kramer, he's still feeling out the Kramer character, but you can tell he's figuring it out and knows that Kramer is going to have certain qualities. So keeping all of that in mind, I think she did a really great job. She sort of matched his quirkiness, and she really shows a range of emotions as well. And I mean, she has only a few scenes, but she shows a lot in those. So I was really impressed. I really enjoyed Ashley Gardner's performance. So Jerry finally gets her attention and says, hey, I was called down here. And she gets very tickled by Tropic of Cancer. And then switches back into reality mode and says, well, this case has been turned over to our library investigator, Mr. Bookman. George enters. He's very distracted. They're like, what's going on with you? He says, did you see that homeless man out on the steps? He thinks it's their old high school gym teacher, Mr. Heyman. Well, we find out that George had gotten him fired, squealed on him, in fact. And there was an incident, but he doesn't want to talk about it with Kramer. He's not ready yet. Well, they find out Bookman's not there. Jerry's irritated, but the librarian will have him get in touch with Jerry. So Jerry leaves, but no, Kramer's sticking around. He needs to talk to this librarian. So next up, we finally see Elaine. We're in Elaine's office. Elaine walks out. She's a little bit confused, looks at the receptionist and asks where Karen is. She's told that, well, she probably went to get lunch. And Elaine was snubbed. She says, she didn't ask me what I wanted. How could she have forgotten? I mean, I've been ordering lunch here for 3 years. So right away, Elaine is panicked. This lunch thing has gotten her in a panic, saying, listen, is there something you're not telling me? Because I'm getting a very weird vibe. The receptionist couldn't be more confused or uninterested. I don't know anything. Mr. Lipman comes out. And right away, Elaine sort of pounces on him and says, oh, Mr. Lipman, did you read that manuscript I gave you, the biography of Columbus? He doesn't really give her much. He just says, yes, I did. Yes, I did. And comments that the water is too cold. Tells the receptionist it's too cold. And Elaine says, yes, it's freezing. It hurts your teeth. The purpose of this scene, we finally see Elaine and we get to learn what her plot is for the episode. She's paranoid she's going to get fired. We see that her relationship with this Mr. Lipman isn't very strong. And well, then there's the lunch snub, the ultimate snub in an office. My overall take, well, first of all, this is a different Mr. Lipman. Eventually, we'll see Richard Fancy take over the role. But for this episode, it was played by a different actor. And I learned in the notes about Nothing that because they liked seeing Elaine in her office more and more, and they found that very entertaining, they needed to cast the Lipman character as more of a recurring actor. So that's why they ultimately went with Richard Fancy. But yeah, this Lipman, I think he did a okay job, but clearly didn't have much. I really like the receptionist. She was played by an actress named Marie Barrientos, who I guess is best known for Law & Order SVU. And I didn't really find much else on her, but I just like she made such a specific choice on how to play that role with just a few lines of dialogue. Just, I don't know anything. Like, it was very memorable to me. I love that choice that she made. And overall, there's really not much to this scene. But once again, JLD makes a meal out of every little thing she's given. I mean, the way she goes from inquiring about lunch to immediately that voice getting shaky when she's asking the receptionist if she knows anything. And you can tell me if I'm going to get fired. I won't say anything. The energy with Lipman is really great. She's trying to keep it together and be cool, even though he, at this point in the series is very wooden and sort of gives her nothing. And that connection she tries to make about the water, it's freezing, hurts your teeth. That little move with the manuscript, she sort of yanks the corner down and the pages like flip really fast. Those are the little moves that are so wonderful in her performance. Every performance she does, she gives those little subtleties that make her performance go from good to great. Next, we move to Monks. Elaine is still stressed about this lunch thing, and she tries to get George in on this because Jerry doesn't really get it. And he's just like, what's the big deal? So they forgot to take your lunch order. And she's like, George, come on, you understand lunch. George is still fixated on Heyman. He doesn't know anything about lunch. So he goes back to that story. So Elaine says, well, what happened? Come on. So he explains the whole can't stand ya. This Heyman hated him, made him smell his own socks. He had a jock on his head for a class. Plus he had little baked bean teeth. And in the flashback, we see, this is something totally new that we haven't seen on the show, this whole flashback element, that this wedgie that he got was led by Mr. Heyman and a bunch of these high school guys. And he has to explain what a wedgie is to Elaine. She didn't know. Jerry says, what do girls do? She says, we just tease someone until they develop an eating disorder. Kramer walks in and says, you better get home, buddy. Bookman is waiting for you. The purpose of this scene, it's really to forward the George plot with Heyman. There's a short mention of Elaine's stress, but it quickly gets swatted away for the other storyline. And my overall take, look, of course I'm biased. I want more Elaine. And so I'm not a fan of the diverting of everything about this scene to go just to George. She brings up her stress, but we just are forced to forget about it because George needs to talk about Heyman. But given that there's not a ton to play with for Elaine, I see why. Hers is the more grounded storyline, and it's very clearly nothing more than just a little small side plot. But at least Elaine got the fantastic line about what girls do, the whole we tease someone until they develop an eating disorder. I think that is such a genius line of dialogue, and it's so relatable. And it just perfectly sums up the difference between the adolescent experience between boys and girls. I certainly lived that. I didn't really live in fear of getting beaten up, but I was more psychologically scarred by the way certain girls bullied me in junior high school. And so, yeah, it really, really stuck with me, this line, because I definitely could relate to it. Moving on, no Elaine in this scene, but we're back in Jerry's apartment. This is the big Bookman scene. Very dramatic. Philip Baker Hall plays Mr. Bookman and basically has this incredible monologue, I have to say, about just how egregious this crime is. And Jerry's just confused. Why is this so dramatic? I love the drawing, the pee-pees and wee-wees. Everything about this was really funny to me. And we also get to see the librarian going to Kramer's door and really freaking out and frantically trying to get into Kramer's apartment because she sees Bookman. The scene ends with Jerry yelling down the hallway at Bookman. He knows he returned that book. He has a witness, Sherry Becker, orange dress, licorice gum. So then he looks up Sherry Becker in his yearbook. So next, naturally, we move on to a scene in Monks with Sherry Becker, all grown up. Well, Sherry remembers the day totally differently. Wore a purple dress. She was chewing Dentyne. Ugh, licorice gum? No way. Then she reminds him, no, they were reading passages from the Tropic of Capricorn, not the Tropic of Cancer. And so Jerry just kind of, a light bulb goes off and says, wait a second, I had both of them. So we go back to the flashback. He gave the book to George in the locker room before George got that traumatic wedgie. Now, Sherry is played by Cynthia Zaghetti. She appeared in numerous television shows, mostly as a guest star, and not a lot that I recognized, although I did see that she appeared in an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm in the year 2000 as an incest group leader. I don't remember that episode. I've watched all of Curb, but I don't remember that. And unfortunately, we lost her. She passed away in 2016. I thought she was great. I thought she was really good in this episode. Moving on, we're back in the library. Kramer and the librarian are on a date. She's reading her poetry to him. He is just over the moon enamored with her. And Bookman catches them and lectures the librarian. So we get another taste of how strict Mr. Bookman is. Next, we are in Jerry's apartment. Elaine is still panicked. Lippman wants to see her, and this can't be good. Jerry says, maybe you're getting a raise. She says, maybe I'm getting a wedgie. Kramer is just overly emotional, crying over Marion's poetry, and Elaine's very concerned. Are you okay? And Kramer can't take it. I can't take it. And he has to leave. And so Elaine you can see something going on in her head. She's looking at the notebook. So Elaine continues telling Jerry about her work stress and is yelling, remember that biography on Columbus? My boss hated it. I'm right here. That little moment always makes me giggle. I love it. And Jerry calls Columbus Euro trash. George enters. Well, he confronted the homeless man, and it was definitely Heyman. And he got a wedgie again. Elaine says, well, at least it wasn't atomic. Out he pulls the waistband of his underwear and he says, it was. Now, I skipped over that part from earlier, but the atomic wedgie is when the waistband goes over the head, which, it just hurts thinking about that. Then Jerry reminds George, I gave you Tropic of Cancer. And then George remembers he dropped the book during that wedgie incident. The purpose of this scene, we see Elaine is still stressed. Kramer's so moved by Marion's poetry, which gives Elaine an idea. And George finds out the homeless man was in fact Heyman, and he got an atomic wedgie. My overall take, clearly this is to serve the Heyman story. We get a little dribble of what's going on with Elaine. Nothing's really moving forward with the Elaine story, but we just know now that Lipman wants to see her in his office. And again, I just loved the yelling and then Jerry saying, I'm right here, right behind her. Always makes me giggle. And I agree with Jerry about Columbus. Eurotrash is right. Yeah, okay, he discovered America, but he was not a good person, people. Look it up. There's your history lesson for the day. Moving on to the last scene of the episode, we're back in the library. Jerry is paying and apologizing to Bookman, and Bookman hates him. You can tell. Exits with a flourish of his jacket. Elaine says, oh, I took your advice, Jerry. I gave my boss Marion's poems. Oh, that's great. Did he like him? No, he didn't. So that storyline's wrapped up. George enters and he says, no, Heyman's gone. He's not on the street anymore. He's really curious. I wonder what happened to him. And then we get a little tag at the end of Heyman as a homeless man just waking up and chanting almost, can't stand ya, can't stand ya. And they pan down and there is a filthy copy of the Tropic of Cancer next to him. The purpose of the scene, of course, it's the resolution to all the storylines. And my overall take, so just I guess to focus on the little piddly storyline for Elaine. So the boss hated Marion's poems. We get to find that out. So just to extract what I can from what this episode entails for Elaine, we just see this establishment more so that Elaine really has an uphill battle at work. And we saw a little bit of that desperation to make strides in her career. In the statue episode, when she worked with Rava, she was so excited that she could have been made editor. But that, of course, didn't work out because of, well, that whole episode. You guys know that. Listen to my podcast about the statue. Little plug. While the story was really brief and there was very little to it, at least we got to see her office for one scene and the original Lipman. It's so, it cracks me up when I'm even saying this because I'll take these little scraps, whatever I can, of Elaine's storylines. And what I mean and why I bring it up is at least we didn't just hear about what Elaine was going through. We actually saw it. We heard about it after that one scene, but we didn't have the faceless suitor dilemma that we've, had in the earlier seasons where we only heard about what was going on with Elaine and we never got to see it. We got to see a sliver of it this time. So, hey, I'll take what I can get. Okay, let's take a quick break and I will see you on the other side. Mom's fast asleep. Time to raid the cookies. What is this thing? Looking for something? Ah! Oh, hi, Mom. Yeah. The days of late night cookie raids are over, thanks to my handy pole mate. When you think of security systems, let me guess, you think of some fancy electronic contraption complete with motion detectors, cameras, and smartphone applications, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that you can protect your valuables without needing all those elaborate gadgets. Hi, I'm Janet Davis, inventor of the PoleMate protection system. During my 40 years as a librarian, I must have slid thousands of newspapers onto long wooden poles for those visitors who wanted to save a quarter. Now I can tell you, we had plenty of books stolen during my tenure, but not one newspaper. With my pole protection system, you can find the perfect length of pole to protect what you need, ranging in sizes from 6 inches to 25 feet. A PoleMate can keep a variety of valuables safe, From your wedding ring to your kid. Simply fasten the pole to your precious item and rest easy, because as I've learned from 40 years on the job at the library, nobody wants to take something attached to a pole. So save your money on all those expensive security systems and buy the perfect pole mate for your protection needs. You can find them at any independent hardware store, and for a limited time, you will receive a free box of nails with purchase. The Pole Mate Protector, because poles are really annoying. And we're back. Okay, so the extras on this episode. For the inside look, Larry Charles was interviewed, and he talked about the Bookman character being influenced by Joe Friday from Dragnet, played by Jack Webb. So I was around 13 when this episode came out, and I remember watching the scenes with Philip Baker Hall as Bookman. And, as a young girl watching it, I definitely appreciated the dramatic sort of interpretation of his performance, but I certainly had no idea what Dragnet was or anything like that. But it felt old-timey, and I knew, I could recognize what it was without knowing specifically what it was from. But I remember appreciating it as a young girl, just going this guy's really nailing it. I have no idea what this is based on, but he's really nailing it. The commentary for this episode was done by Larry Charles, and he mentions Josh White, which was really great. And he, it talks about how it was such a thrill to work with Josh, and he was known for his rock and roll light shows in New York. He was also married to Alice Playton, who was famous for an Alka-Seltzer commercial, and among many things, but he mentions, Larry Charles mentions that in the commentary, and he just really says that Josh was such a nice man. I looked up the commercial that Larry Charles refers to. It's really charming. I recommend you look it up. And Alice Playton is very adorable in it. Larry Charles talks about the flashback technique and how he was always trying to expand the visual vocabulary of the show. I mention this because I love the term visual vocabulary. I'm totally stealing that. I love it. He talks about Elaine's storyline and how it's mundane, but it's relatable. It became fun for him to write for Elaine as soon as he established her to be as neurotic as the others. And I think that's significant. I think along the lines of what I've talked about before with Larry David giving that direction to the writers, hey, just write her as a guy. Don't think about her, gender or anything like that. So I think Larry Charles brings another element into that with, let's just write this gender neutral and write it as neurotic as the other characters on the show. Larry Charles really hated the wigs that George and Jerry wore during the flashbacks. He said that on the show, they all discussed their regret of the week, and that was his. He just wished those wigs looked better. He's very disappointed. Even watching it, you could tell the tone in his voice watching that episode going, those wigs, I can't stand it. Can't stand ya. And finally, he just, again, towards the end of the episode, he really said, I loved working with Josh White. He's so collaborative, very gentle man. And he doesn't remember why Josh was even a director for this episode. It was so out of the blue. We will get to that during my interview with Josh. Just a little teaser. But he loved that he was such a gentle and thoughtful person. And he was given a slice of film with the light show image from Josh, from the light show that Josh produced. And he still carries it in his wallet to this day. So I thought that was very sweet. Few things in the notes about nothing. They mention how Josh White directed this episode, and they mention some of his other credits, some television shows, Flying Blind, the original Max Talking Headroom show, and Delta House. He also directed a TV movie, Disco Beaver from Outer Space. Oh, and some additional things about Elaine for this episode. Earlier draft in the script, Elaine was supposed to have been accused of writing obscenities on the walls of Pendant's ladies' room. That seems very out of character for Elaine. I mean, even later Elaine, maybe not later Elaine, but I really wonder where that would have gone, but clearly they changed that draft. And also, an early draft revealed that Elaine wasn't crazy when she worried about the lunch ordering. She wasn't forgotten about. She was, in fact, deliberately left off the lunch order because they knew she's a vegetarian and they wanted to eat from a deli that day. So that gets revealed in an early draft, but it did not make it into the final cut. All right, moving on to Contributor Corner. Greg has some thoughts this week. So Greg says, this episode has always bothered me. It feels too silly to me, almost like an episode from early season 1. While the whole basis of the show is to find comedy in the ordinary, this is borderline ridiculous. I do love the throwbacks to Jerry and George as kids and George's torment with his high school gym teacher, but this overall feels like it was written by an outsider. The pure coincidence of Jerry having an overdue library book from when he was in high school and George thinking he saw a teacher from that same time is all too much. Okay, Greg, I definitely see your points here. You're not wrong. It doesn't feel like the normal finding the comedy in the ordinary. I agree with you. I think if all of the storylines, the Elaine one would have been that if they'd given it more attention. But I guess I enjoyed how much they packed into this episode, and I forgive the, I guess, borderline ridiculous things you talk about, the elements. So, but that's so interesting. Yeah, I can see why you think this feels like it was written by an outsider, when in fact I think it's written by probably Seinfeld's best writer, Larry Charles. Moving on, Greg says, Elaine is over the top desperate and worrying why her lunch order wasn't taken and how her career is up in the air seems out of character for her. She could have seen it as vindictive, but for her to be paranoid about her job sounds more like George than Elaine. I find it believable because, again, that establishment from the statue episode where Elaine was, you could just tell, she does mention Lipman in that episode, and you can tell she really wants to impress him. So I don't know. To me, it just seems more like a continuation of her feeling maybe a little bit stuck and really wanting to make some strides there at Pendant Publishing. So But this is what you're identifying, though, by saying it feels more like George than Elaine. Well, Larry Charles openly admits that he wrote this as a neurotic Elaine versus maybe what we've seen established so far. Yeah, I guess I don't see it as very out of character just because it reminded me from the statue episode where the excitement she felt of possibly being moved up to editor, by working with Rava, you could just feel how much she needed that. So for me, it doesn't seem that out of character. I could see her being a bit paranoid at work because of maybe how stuck she feels. And moving on to Greg's last point, he says, I don't have much more to say about this episode. I really dislike it. While Friends did a phenomenal job showing the main characters in flashback to high school episodes, Seinfeld fell short. Even the cheap wigs are terrible. Well, Larry Charles and you are on the same page there. I mean, yeah, they don't look great, but I honestly think that makes it funnier. It's almost like, and I don't think it was intentionally meant to look bad, but I thought their wigs were hilarious. It just added to the comedy for me. But okay. So Greg is not a fan of this episode. I don't look at it as harshly. But hey, I have nothing but respect for Greg. He always sends in some wonderful thoughts that make me think different ways about the episodes. So thank you so much, Greg, for sharing your thoughts about the library. And if you would like to become a contributor to Hot and Heavy, please email me at elainepodcast@gmail.com. That's elainepodcast@gmail.com. And you could hear your thoughts on a future episode. Okay, so let's move on to my interview with Josh White, the director of this episode. So I mentioned earlier that Lee, our contributor, Lee, was the person who reached out to me and said, hey, I know Josh White. Let me get you in touch with him. It's a very touching and fascinating story. So Lee discovered that Josh White is his biological father. He went on a quest to find his biological parents and found out, my goodness, my father is this accomplished director and artist. And so they got in touch and have had a relationship ever since. And to quote Lee, what he says about Josh, he says, I can honestly say that but for Josh, I wouldn't be half the person I am today. That's just incredibly touching. So not only did I get a chance to speak with a director of a Seinfeld episode, it's part of an incredibly touching story that involves a friend of mine, and I just couldn't be more honored to, first of all, be Lee's friend. He's an incredible person and very talented writer. I loved working with him on a sketch show a couple summers ago before the world just changed and we could do sketch shows in person and perform. But to have this opportunity that Lee afforded me to talk to Josh it's just so special to me. I just appreciate it so much. So you already know that Josh directed this episode, but a little bit more background. He is an American artist, video maker, and television director. In addition to directing many television shows, his art is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and has been exhibited all over the world. He's best known for the Joshua Light Show, which was a liquid light show that served as a lighting backdrop behind many live performances in the 60s and 70s for artists. You may have heard of some of these people, like Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, The Who, just to name a few of them. And that's just a snippet of his career, mind you. I highly recommend you look up Josh's body of work. It's pretty impressive. And one small part of that body of work is directing this episode of Seinfeld. So without further ado, here is my interview with Josh. I'd like to welcome Josh White, who is the director of the library episode, the episode I'm covering this week. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Hi, Shivani. I'm very good. Thank you. I'm so glad you called.
Thank you so much for doing this. Needless to say, I'm extremely excited to talk to someone who worked on my favorite show of all time and worked with Julia Louis-Dreyfus. How did you come to be a director on this episode of Seinfeld?
Well, it's a bit of a mystery. I can put the clues in place, but the exact reason why they suddenly called me up is confusing. I'll give you the backstory. I had worked with Larry David on the Max Headroom series for Cinemax. It was 6 talk shows featuring Max Headroom. Larry was a writer and a performer then, and he had now, this was many years later, in the 90s, he moved to Hollywood, and he was now producing this show, the Seinfeld. And another writer on that show that partnered on the Max Headroom show was Charlie Rubin. So I knew them both. And I was pursuing my career as a director. I had been doing a lot of music, and then in the 80s, I moved back to New York, and I was doing shows like Max Headroom and children's series for HBO called Encyclopedia. It was all shows that played to my ability to improvise. I really have always been a loose director and artist in that I work with what I find rather than try to get everybody just to do exactly what I've specified. And it's worked out very well for me. It worked out when I did psychedelic light shows in the 60s. It worked out when I did early music on television, rock music, and it's been working out. Anyway, it's now 1991, many years after I work with Charlie and Larry, and I'm speaking with Charlie on the phone. In New York, he's in LA. He's writing the third season of Seinfeld. And Larry David comes walking by, and he says, "I'll be with you in a moment. I'm just talking to Josh White." And Larry David said, "Oh, that's great. I wonder if he'd like to come out and direct one of our episodes." And I said, "Sure, tell him it's fine." Next thing I know, my agent calls and said, "Seinfeld wants your quote," which is basically, for those that don't know, it's, "What are you asking to do this job?" My quote was basically 10% above the Directors Guild minimum, because it was a lot of money then and now. And next thing I know, I'm on a plane going out to Hollywood. It was after Labor Day weekend. There was a producer-director on the show, an old-timer named Tom Sharonis.
Yes.
And Tom had those skills that literally were developed in the I Love Lucy days. In other words, 3 cameras, and you told them where to go, and then you rehearsed the show, and you worked through the show for continuity. So you'd go from set to set, and the sets were all laid out. So suddenly on a Wednesday morning in October of '91, I find myself walking into a studio, and I meet everybody, literally everybody, for the first time. And I don't know what, including Tom Sharonis, who was still there as the producer.
Yeah.
He gave me encouragement. He was one of it was the kind of person that I had never really tried to be. He's a big guy with a beard and a Hawaiian shirt. And one of the things that the writers had to do was stand there during various run-throughs and laugh really loudly to give the audience, to give the performers a sense of where the jokes may be.
Right. Yes.
A better phrase. Where are the jokes?
Yes.
And the next thing I know, we're sitting around a table having a table read, and I'm leading it. These are all things that I understood.
Right.
And I'd worked in sitcoms before, especially when I lived out in Los Angeles, but I'd never done the free camera kind where it's just done like a play.
Right.
And everybody was totally focused and very much involved with this series. It hadn't quite become like the super success that it became, but it was on its way. People were beginning to pay attention.
Right.
And I thought each of the actors was incredibly distinctive, but they were very focused in the sense that there wasn't a lot of small talk. Mm-hmm. It was just, let's do it. And I recognized that. And so I just said, okay, let's start. And, Act 1, Scene 1. Act 1, Scene A, Jerry's apartment. And we all march over to Jerry's apartment. And they do it. And I make small corrections. And I haven't really made a lot of changes or anything because they're doing it really well. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you have to learn to do less.
Yes.
Yeah, and that went on a Wednesday and a Thursday, and by Thursday I could see one of the things that they'd never done before. They were doing something that was interesting because I'd never seen them do a flashback on the show.
Yes,
everything they did was pretty much in the present, and I don't think they had a big idea of how to do it. It just said, in the past.
Sure.
And in this episode, it's the one where they're trying to remember what happened to The Tropic of Cancer, a book that Jerry took out of the library.
Correct.
And so over the weekend, I storyboarded a scene that could be shot using their techniques, which were 3 cameras really, heavily planted on the ground on dollies and things without upsetting it too much. But I was able to give it a certain look.
Yeah.
And because nobody really focused on it, I said, well, let's not just say they were in high school. Let's say they were at Kennedy High. Sure. It just gives it more, a little bit more oomph. Let's make sure that they have pure 70s haircuts, wigs,
yes,
and that the costumes are right. And they accepted it. They seemed to appreciate it. And I came back on Monday and we picked up, and on Wednesday night, it was done.
It's so great that you say that. It's so interesting because that flashback element of that episode, it's so memorable to me. And just to give you a little background, I mean, I was 13 years old in 1991, and I was a Seinfeld fan from early on. And so, those earlier episodes, and especially doing this podcast, you really recognize, especially seeing, looking forward to what the show had become once it sort of found its legs and found the pacing and all that. Those early episodes, you can kind of tell they're still trying to figure it out. And this episode, to me, that the whole flashback aspect of it, for my little, 13-year-old sensibility, for a show that was pretty, it was pretty grown up for someone that was my age to get into, but I still got into it. That flashback and the elements you were talking about that you added, I mean, it was so awesome to see those little touches of their hair being so 70s, and that was the stuff that made it memorable for me. So I love hearing the behind the scenes of bringing that to the episode, because like you said, the flashback portion of it was definitely it was a departure from what they had done up until that point. So
yes.
I really, really appreciated that. And so being that the show was sort of so different from other sitcoms at the time, and with your background, it was very different from what you were used to. Did you find anything really challenging about directing this episode?
No, I just had to find a place for myself. I from the moment I got there, I sensed that these people were in the groove. There wasn't any of the kind of problems that I had had in previous sitcoms that I directed. I directed the TV version of Animal House, and it was so heavily layered with censorship and everything that and the characters were all mostly derivatives of the characters in the great movie.
Yeah.
So a lot of time was spent with people who were frustrated, angry, and even in the 70s and the 80s, and even in the early 90s, everything was still done in a very ritualistic way. And by that I mean that the technology had not opened up yet, so that that the Seinfeld show was basically shot the same way I Love Lucy was. I mean, the cameras might have had better lenses and been a little more mobile, but unless the script specifically called for something, it was going to be three angles, a wider shot and then a coverage from either side. So technically, it wasn't that hard.
Okay.
And because we were doing it in real time, going through it, there weren't any of the continuity problems or things that we had to suffer with or deal with in the single camera film projects.
Sure.
And again, by the time I got there, everybody knew everybody. I didn't know a soul except the writer, but everybody knew everybody. And Larry David was clearly in charge. I mean, I rehearsed them, got them ready. We showed it to Larry. Larry was very nice to me and so smart and incredibly articulate. And they were speaking, a language among themselves in which they sort of knew, and they were learning about the characters. I made observations of I've watched several of the episodes and I had caught up a lot on the theory. It was interesting because there was no sexual tension.
Yeah.
It was talked about, or there would be the girlfriend, and they just got more and more luscious as the seasons went on.
Yes.
But considering that Elaine and Jerry had this background, I was quite surprised at that. I observed that there was no sexual tension between them. They were all literally these phenomenal narcissistic egos.
Yeah.
But not in a destructive way. They were just each one of them saw each situation from their point of view, and then they would have that experience if we saw it, and then they would share it with extra details, which made it funnier. But they were comfortable. Were comfortable. I can remember that I didn't have much. I didn't really have a lot of connections or conversations with Julia Louis-Dreyfus, because she was totally focused on her part and she knew just what to do. And again, this episode was really more focused on the romance between Kramer and the librarian, which I really worked hard on, and Jerry's Jerry's experience with the library.
Yes.
So things like Elaine's side adventures of dealing with her boss, presenting. I think she was presenting a novel or something.
Right.
The scenes in her office, they were pro forma is not the right word, but they were pretty straight, and she knew, who she was. But she'd do these little things, I'll give you anecdotes because I think you like that.
Yes, please.
Okay. In this episode, her boss was played by someone who, I think his name Mr. Lipton, was played by a different actor. I forget who ultimately played it. Maybe it was Larry. I don't know, but it was a bald guy, and he was an actor. And they were shooting in what was her office, but it was really where the secretary was, and she was trying to get him to read this, and he wasn't giving her any any real feedback, and he was focused on drinking water or something.
Yes.
But when we actually did it in front of the audience, the actor playing the part went to the wrong door backstage. It looked like it was near the one that he would come through, but it wasn't the right door. It was another door which couldn't open.
Oh no!
So she gives the cue, and then we're waiting. And finally I go back there, and he can't get the door open.
Oh my goodness!
And it was a moment which could have destroyed whatever whatever concentration there was. But everybody laughed. It was funny, and we went on, and he looked through he came to the right door. But that was the first time I really saw the subtlety of her performance, that she continued all the way, always, including, VP, which I think was a brilliant series, or Vice, whatever it was called.
Yeah, Veep, yeah.
And Veep, that's it, Veep. I almost got it.
Close enough.
But anyway, but she had, and I realized that she had the best shit-eating grin I've ever seen. She could just smile and look awful.
Yeah.
And so effectively that later on in a subsequent scene, they asked her, along with a million other things going on, they asked her, what did he think, of, did he like the novel?
Right.
And she said something like, no, he didn't. but she said it in a way that brought back the entire scene, where she was trying to get him to read or do something. I haven't watched this in a long time, so forgive me.
No, that's okay.
You'll have to fill in the details.
Yes.
But it was just, no, he didn't.
Yeah.
No, he didn't. And I remember too, in the uncomfortable scene in his office, she's trying to connect with him, and the only thing that she can really comment upon is how cold the water is. It makes your teeth freeze.
Hurts your teeth,
like
yeah.
Yeah, hurts your teeth. And that to me said a lot about that character, that she's and why she was so perfect as part of the gang, because she just was so wonderfully disconnected from the real world, as they all were. I mean, even Jerry was supposed to be grounded, but you really didn't think so.
Exactly. And eventually, it's funny, and like I said earlier, as I'm watching this from the first episode on, it's so clear what the first attempts were with these characters, and then when we get into maybe the more popular and more classic episodes or seasons later on, you see kind of them, they will go a little more broad or a little more absurdist with the humor. But I think what I fell in love with Julie Louis-Dreyfus at such a young age was exactly what you were talking about, where she takes these little moments, and I should note, in these early episodes, she was given very little for the most part. And so... but she would take...
And nobody was writing for her either at that point.
Yes. And in fact, I had a little anecdote that I learned in a book that is about Seinfeld, kind of like an unauthorized book about it. It's called Seinfeldia. They talk about how Larry had a moment with the writers, and it was after Julie Louis-Dreyfus expressed her dissatisfaction by saying, hey guys, I can do more than you're giving me. And they right away recognized, we're a room full of men trying to write for her. So what are we doing wrong? And Larry David gave the direction to the writer's room, said, just write her like a guy. And that sort of took away that, I think probably the overthinking of what they were doing with saying, well, we have to write this from a female perspective. Just write a storyline for her. And eventually, I think what they learned was that she will take it and wrap it in her own interpretation that includes a female take on it anyway. So
which is only what actors are supposed to do.
Exactly.
But in the medium, in a recorded medium, that's hard to do. It was hard to do in films, and even harder to do in a 3-camera sitcom.
Yes.
But because you don't know which camera's looking at you, you don't know where to play it. I mean, it gets covered, but they definitely brought in I think, Carol Leifer to write for her.
Right.
And,
Yes.
and that made sense because she was, in Larry's world, a kind of an Elaine. You know,
Right.
I'd done some comedy specials with her, and she was absolutely, this brilliant, very funny, smart woman who was in this world of men and was always trying to,
Yes.
to meet guys and at the same time maintain her independence as a comedian. And,
Right.
and it was interesting that they came to that, but to their credit, they did.
Yeah.
This was not Larry. This what I observed then, and I don't know how long it lasted, but this was not at the stage I was there. This was not Larry as God. You know,
Right.
This was not at the level that some of the other sitcom directors from Mary Tyler Moore and that whole generation, where after a while they became the nobody arguing with him.
Yeah.
But Larry spent a lot of time arguing, and I don't mean stupid arguing. I mean just debating things with somebody. I'm not sure who it was. It might have been Howard West or one of those people, but he argued all the time. And at night and after the audience left, we would go back and do scenes again.
Yeah.
Just to make them better. And I just remember a lot of him fighting for his ideas and discussing, breaking things down. It was not uncomfortable. It was a little tiring, but it was not uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And he was very sweet to me. He said, "Oh, you must feel terrible. I'm doing all the talking here." And I said, "Larry, I'm not."
Right.
I'm not. It's great because they really knew what they were doing.
And I love that because one of the things I'm learning, and just as a fan of the show, I'd always see specials or see kind of behind the scenes or read articles about the show. And I think something that really struck a chord with me as someone who is writing material a lot and trying to figure out my voice as a writer and a performer, I love their conviction, both Larry and Jerry, where they said, look, you guys, we might not know the ins and outs of making a show. We don't know the rules of a network or a sitcom per se, but we know funny. And so whether or not you agree with the way we're doing it, we believe in our material, and we believe that, like, are you funny? These corporate suits, I guess you could call them. But and to me, that was, I think, I don't think the show would have happened. I mean, there were so many things I think that were perfect at that time and the era that television was in at that time, that Seinfeld was given that room to breathe and grow and stuff. But I think that their conviction of just believing in their material, knowing, like, we know funny. You guys might know the structure of a show and the camera angles and this and that and numbers from, ratings and all that. But we know funny. And so don't argue with us about or don't, stifle ideas that we have, because, like, the classic Chinese restaurant episode, that was never done. And when I covered that episode for the podcast, the interviews on the DVD extras it was so fascinating. Warren Littlefield was just I got the script and I said, what am I missing? Nothing happens, and they play on this on the show later when they do the Jerry pilot. But I love
a show about nothing.
A show about nothing.
We all remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I love hearing that about just some arguments happening behind the scenes, because I wouldn't expect anything different from Larry David, just admitting what he doesn't know, but really believing in what he does know. So that's always been an inspiring part of that whole
exactly.
machine.
And I've always craved those kind of experiences in my life, and I've enjoyed enough of them. Certainly not on that level, but I've enjoyed enough of them to know that at a certain point, that people are going to trust you and respect you.
Yeah.
And let you go without feeling they have to comment. Because if you remember, the first seasons of Seinfeld were punctuated with him doing stand-up.
Yes.
Which I'm sure came right from the network.
Yep.
Because they thought no one will know him. We have to establish the fact.
Right.
And so for them to have to write, which they did very well, a very brief stand-up routine, which was performed in front of actors.
Yes.
That was humor about the humor.
Yeah.
That was not easy, but they let that go, which was good. It was interesting the kind of power that the networks had then, and if they still have it now, I'm not seeing it.
Yeah.
Because what you had were people who were came out of the early days of television. Television wasn't that old.
Yeah.
30 years ago,
Right.
and so they kept bringing with them broadcast standards, all of the things, and whims. So I remember when I was first in California, it was just a bunch of us who were all contemporaries. One of them was Henry Winkler, who went on to become the Fonz.
Yeah.
And for the first few shows, they wouldn't let him wear a leather jacket for no reason other than somebody at the network had a sense in their mind that a leather jacket meant Marlon Brando, James Dean. That it was they let him wear a leather jacket very quickly, and then he became this amazing character that literally glued the series together. But it was just those a million little things.
Right, and I can't imagine the Fonz without a leather jacket.
Right.
Yeah.
And when I was doing Delta House, it was not just not well done, even though the people were quite talented. It was put on in what was then called the Family Hour. It was 8:00, in which came with a whole set of limitations about what you could do when the family is gathered around the TV, which of course was nonsense. And I remember that there was an actor who I knew, Josh Mostel, son of Zero Mostel, who was playing a character who was supposed to be Bluto's brother, the John Belushi's brother, and he was a good actor, but he couldn't do any of the outrageous things that the Belushi Bluto did. His character's name was Mulatto, and it's almost like you can't make this shit up.
Yeah.
and they wouldn't let him drink beer because they were always drinking beer.
Right.
So I said, fine, I had a little more flexibility because it was so rigid. I said, have him drink milk. He just drinks it like beer. And they didn't let us do that either. It was just interesting. No, he's swigging it. That's wrong.
Yeah.
But nobody. The basic material wasn't any good.
Yeah.
So there's nothing you can do. And the thing with Seinfeld, literally from the first one, the material was so good.
Yes.
It was so good.
Yes.
And when there was a little window for someone like me who's loose, to get inside, like, for example, my relationship with Philip Baker Hall, was he was a good actor from New York whose work I knew. So I told him the work I liked, and he was as sweet as could be.
And this is the actor who played Bookman. I just want to
yes,
right.
a very good actor who'd done so much work.
Yes,
and they were all actors. I mean, Jason Alexander was a Broadway star,
right?
And I said, I think this guy has seen too much Dragnet, too much Jack Webb, and he didn't say any more than that, and he picked up on that.
Sure,
so fast,
yes.
The whole thing. And then we talked briefly about something I'd seen. It was like a not well done, a super cheap movie in which they had. This was a real story. And when I was first starting, in which they had drafted a high school acting teacher to play a principal in a school, and the guy was delivering his lines, and when he looked left and was pointing at something, he'd point with his left hand, which would be upstage.
Right.
And then when he turned around to talk to somebody else, he'd point with his right hand, which was upstage. And it was like a perfect student acting exercise. And I in some way passed this on to Philip. And I didn't tell him specifically, but he absolutely understood the idea of that being unpredictable in a terribly predictable way. And Jerry had a great reaction because he just had to smile. He had to smile that smile.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just remembered in the flashback sequence, I did mentioned that it would be very funny if Jerry was wearing braces, but that was a step too far, and it wasn't for any censorship. This is too hard to do.
Yeah,
I got the idea too late.
Sure. Yeah, that would have been hilarious though. But yeah, no. But back to Philip Baker Hall. That performance is just the scene stealer of the entire episode. It's a great episode for the cast itself, and obviously Julia Louis-Dreyfus didn't have, it was the B plot, and it wasn't, too much of, but she did great with what she had. But the guest actors, Philip Baker Hall and I'll know her name once I get...
Ashley Gardner.
Yes, who played the library.
By the way, I don't have total recall. I'm holding the guest cast list in front of me.
Oh, wonderful!
I'm not that good at remembering actors from 30 years ago.
Josh, you didn't have to say that. We would have just thought, my goodness, he just has this.
I hope it's Ashley Gardner. but she was lovely, and she gave the same performance in the first reading that she did in the show. She never changed, which was great because she just got it.
Yes.
And she had to fall in love with Kramer.
Right. But she sort of matched the like personality trait to personality trait, like in a different way. She played it so quirky as well, like annoyed / just conflicted. Like there was always something behind those eyes. She was struggling. And
exactly. And I just wanted to believe that there was a spark between them, and I believed it. I believed it from the table read.
Yes,
I was never worried about that.
I know
it's a much loved episode. I had nothing to do with that. I just for me it's wonderful because I was given an opportunity to. I guess it was to fill in because they had other directors coming in. I don't think they were searching for a replacement. There was some reason. I just don't know what it was. Maybe there was some friction between the old-timer Tom Sharonis and the young Turk Larry David. And Larry David wanted to prove that any idiot could direct the show. And that's why I got the call. And, of course, I did.
Right. That sounds like a Larry thing to do. Just based on my knowledge as a viewer of his and an observer of his career. Well, at any rate, you did a fantastic job with the episode. I know you're being humble saying that you had nothing to do with the quality of it, but it was one of those episodes that just stood out to me, again, as a 13-year-old watching it, the flashbacks, the baked bean teeth with, the Mr. Heyman. Yes, all those things stuck, and it was a really, really fun episode. Well, Josh, I just wanted to ask you, was there, if anything you haven't mentioned already, any favorite memories from that experience for you?
Yeah, I'll tell you just two little things, just because in the sense of your focus, not just on the show, but on an actor who I really respect, who is a perfect actor in the medium of television.
Yeah.
And we're finally getting to that point where it's you're not doing it in order to make movies.
Right.
Because she really didn't have a movie career.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of really great actors who just, go from being brilliant on Broadway to wanting to be in the movies, and the camera, it's a totally different relationship, and it's very hard to explain, but I can list, the number of people who just don't have movie careers, and fortunately that's no longer a prerequisite for fame and fortune. You can do it on television. So I do remember one moment that I'll just share with you because you're a sort of a completist here. The event, because we did the show in order, about the fourth thing we rehearsed was the coffee shop, which of course is iconic and so simple to do.
Yeah.
And they'd been on hiatus, and so I guess they hadn't shot in the coffee shop in a while. And they're sitting there, and we're all ready to rehearse. And Julia opens up the creamer, and it still had some cream in it, but now it was cream and like maggots or something.
Oh gosh!
Nothing terrifying, but it terrified her. And I thought, I thought in the moment, just don't be such a wuss. It's just so. And then I realized it interrupted her focus and her performance.
Right.
It took a little while to calm her down and to do it again. But it was, at first I thought it was just, silly, but now I've come to realize that she just, that world was so predictable. The sets were so simple,
Right.
and it didn't have to. So when you open up the same creamer, she was probably going to pick it up and pour cream in her coffee.
Yeah.
And bingo, there it was. I also got to see something which was really quite brilliant, which was at the very end of the show, in the last act, George is explaining how he was sure that the character, the bum on the library steps, was Mr. Heyman.
Right.
And I think the comic line was, well, at least he didn't give you a wedgie. Okay?
Right.
Now, I think it ended there. But late at the very end, because it's the last scene, so at midnight, we're doing it one more time. And I can see Larry and Jason just talking it over, and a person there. And they do it one more time, and I forget who it is. Maybe it's Elaine, says, well, at least he didn't give you a wedgie. And George reaches behind and pulls out of his pants, pulls some white torn underwear.
Yes.
And he says, yes, he did. Or yes, he did.
Right.
Which was something that they found at the very, very, very end of the moment. I had nothing to do with it.
Wow.
But it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
And I think they weren't even sure they could get away with it to the degree that they had a perfectly good take where he didn't do that. So
Yeah.
But it's in the show. It's in the show.
That's so great. And that's what I'm learning too when I'm just researching each episode, how many things were added in rehearsals or added on the moment. I think now that's sort of, well, it depends on the show, but I feel like that is a little bit more common where they'll have alts, right? And they'll have different lines of dialogue, just that they'll have the actors do different versions of different things. And, but that's an iconic moment. It's in, I think, almost every clip episode where he pulls out the waistband of his underwear. And I love that. I love those those moments of brilliance that you think, let's just try it. And then it becomes something so iconic.
Or let's do something that they just come up with something that's just a step up without going off course, you know, and that to me was the comic genius. I had an amazing time doing it. I thought that everything, all the energy and everything came from Larry. Yeah. Everybody else was doing their job, but it was Larry. Mm-hmm. And I remember the second day I was there, we broke for lunch, and someone came and said, Larry would like to talk to you in his office. And I'm not afraid, but I'm going, uh-oh.
Of course.
And I go up to his office, and there's a Larry, and I think maybe Larry Charles and some of the other people. And they wanted to see me. They're sitting around with an enormous plate of sushi, and they say, sit down, have some sushi. So tell us, what was it like to work on the Jerry Lewis telethon?
Oh,
and
wow.
That's what they wanted to know, because I directed the Jerry Lewis telethon.
Yes.
And I had seen his famous film, The Day the Clown Cried. And they just wanted to know that. They couldn't have cared less about the show. They had a person of interest there who could tell them something they wanted to know.
Yes. It
was a great moment. It was a bonding experience. It was a great moment.
Yeah.
They wanted to know.
That's so wonderful. And that's the sense I'm getting to. They're so knowledgeable about both Jerry and Larry specifically. They're just a fan of television. They're a fan of show business, right? And they just, anything like that, if they know someone has knowledge about that. Because I also think Liz Sheridan, who played Helen Seinfeld, she, for a brief amount of time, I believe she dated James Dean before he was James Dean. And Jerry Seinfeld was just, he couldn't stop asking her questions about, well, tell me about Jane, so that's such a great moment, and it's not surprising at all. Well, thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate this. This was fantastic, and I just I didn't want to say much because I loved everything you were saying, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Absolutely. My pleasure. I wish you well with this. I also think it's perfect to have somebody do what you're doing now 30 years on.
Yeah.
I think I'm having that experience with other elements of my life, including my light show performances, the Jerry Lewis telethon, things that I've done. And people are focusing on it's not about being fans anymore. It's about being that character, because she was on for so many hours as that character.
Yes.
And so your focus, I'll listen.
Good.
I'm interested. I'm interested.
Thank you so
and
much.
Someday, who knows? Maybe we'll meet.
I would love that. Okay, thank you so much, Josh. Have a good day.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye. I'm still smiling from that conversation. And he was so generous with his time. So I'm so thankful. Thanks again, Josh. It was a true honor to speak to you. So my favorite Elaine moment of the episode, her office scene was really kind of most substance she had. And to pick a moment, the moment where she says, "It hurts your teeth." She's trying so hard. She's desperate Elaine again. It's similar to what we see from Elaine in the baby shower episode where she's trying so hard to have a moment with someone who intimidates her. So the hurts your teeth part is my favorite Elaine moment from this episode. And my final notes, as far as the Elaine portion, it's very meh. I wish we could have gotten more moments from Elaine. Now, usually, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that I will often identify some swap out opportunities where I've been like, we didn't need this much of this Kramer scene or this Jerry scene. We could have had more Elaine if they just swapped this out. But honestly, I'm not sure what we could have sacrificed from the Jerry, George, or Kramer moments or plots. I honestly enjoyed all of them. And even the Kramer plot, I thought he and Ashley Gardner were a really good match together. And I guess with that being said, I'm just thankful we got what we did with Elaine. And the guest stars were outstanding in this episode. Philip Baker Hall was clearly the standout as Bookman, but Ashley Gardner was wonderful as Marion the librarian, and even that receptionist who I mentioned. Those little moments. Now, of course, I would have preferred more Elaine, but I always love, too, when the guest stars really get moments to shine, and that was true in this episode. And I think that's all I can say about the library. Thank you again to Josh White for speaking with me. I absolutely loved our interview and our conversation. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.